I, I'm not a preacher. I don't claim to be, and I'm not going to try to preach. What I do like to do is tell stories. In the Bible, they used parables to explain things, and I'm glad they used parables because some of the thoughts that Jesus had and he passed on, I wouldn't have understood otherwise. But I'm going to tell you a story about a man named John McCandless. John was a very big man. He was 6'6", weighed over 280 pounds. He grew up in foster care because he was abandoned as an infant. He never knew his parents. Some of the shorter periods of his childhood was spent in orphanages, but he lived in a rural area, and because of his large size, there was a lot of foster families that wanted to have him come out to their place because he was a good worker, working on farms and helping out. But because he was treated more as a farmhand than a child, he grew up not really knowing a whole lot about love and care and compassion. Another thing that hindered John was because of his huge size, there's a lot of people wanted to see if he was as tough as he looked. Their problem was that he was. He had to fight so much growing up that when he graduated from high school, he decided he'd go in the Army. He said, if I've got to fight, I might as well get paid for it. The year was about 1968. Vietnam was going hot and heavy. Those of you that are here that remember those days. John did 3 tours of Vietnam. Got out in 1972. He was a highly decorated soldier. Well, those of you that have been around also know that in the civilian world, there's not a lot of demand for soldiers. The only thing John knew besides soldiering was being a farmhand. And he knew for sure he didn't want to be a farmhand. Well, when people are faced with decisions like that and there's no certainty in their future, a lot of times things don't turn out the best. John fell in with a bike gang. Well, he had a little bit of a violent nature because of what he had been through in Vietnam, not knowing a whole lot of affection growing up. The brotherhood that he felt among these bikers was the closest thing to love that he had ever known in his life. Well, because he was so tough, I don't know if you know this, I got to hear the testimony of a gentleman named Barry White, not the soul singer, a white guy from South Carolina. He was state president of the Hells Angels of South Carolina. About every 5 years, they had a re-election for officers in the club. Last man standing after a big brawl was the president. Well, John became an enforcer for this bike gang. And if you don't know what an enforcer is, you're blessed and you don't want to know. But he's the guy that does the things that need to get their point across. He was well on his way to being a hardened criminal and maybe winding up in prison. And I met quite a few guys like that. Those of you that know me know I rode motorcycles most of my life. Back in the 60s, there was a commercial that said you meet the nicest people on a Honda. Well, I didn't ride a Honda, I rode a Harley, and the people I met were certainly not the nicest people you could meet. But as years went by, being raised in the church, I couldn't get that far away from it. My mother kept her foot on my neck pretty tight. I came back to the Lord and I joined a group called the Christian Motorcyclists Association. Later, 5 friends of mine and I split off and we organized a group called the Good News Riders because we were interested in doing prison ministry. Part of my testimony is I've been in prison in 5 states. Of course, they let me go home at night. But I met a lot of guys in these prisons like John. And there seemed to be almost a recurring theme that the ones that would open up and talk to you, they had all grown up like that. There hadn't been a bunch of love in their lives. They hadn't known a lot of affection. They hadn't known a warm family or a church family. Well, John's cruising along heading for prison and other bad things. And guess what happens? what happens to so many young men. He met a girl. Her name was Melissa. And John started having feelings he didn't really know what they were. He didn't know how to define them. He didn't know what they meant, or he didn't know what to do about them. Love was a pretty foreign concept and pretty scary to him. And in spite of his rough and ready ways and his intimidating size, she fell for him just about as hard as he did for her. Well, she refused to settle for anything less than marriage, so John did. They got married. He found a job with the railroad in Mississippi where they were living, and he more or less kind of settled down there. He started spending less and less time with his biker buddies. And if you know anything about motorcycle culture, the only way you do that is everybody else in the club has to be scared of you because they won't let you go. Well, things are going pretty good. He's got a job. About a year later, they're expecting a baby. John's got a promotion. He's become the yard boss at a small switching station in Mississippi that, despite being in a rural area and small community, it's a pretty busy switch yard. If you've ever heard of the train called the City of New Orleans, it runs from Chicago to New Orleans. It came through this switch yard. Strangely enough, it's called the City of New Orleans when it comes down to New Orleans, and when it goes back to Chicago, it's still called the City of New Orleans. Well, things are going pretty good. The child is born, but things turn bad again. Melissa died in childbirth. Well, John's world is coming crumbling down. But he becomes a very devoted father. He names the little girl Missy after her mother. For the first couple of years, while she's still young, he leaves her with a neighbor while he's working. As soon as she's able to, he starts taking her to work with him. I don't know if any of you ever been in a switching yard or a rail yard. A switching track, you have a rail coming in, and it can be moved to 2 or 3 positions even. There's a big pit dug out underneath the railways for all the mechanism that moves these rails. If you've ever seen a rail, it's a pretty sturdy piece of steel, and it takes a pretty strong mechanism to move it. Well, this yard was halfway modernized, and it had motorized switching gear, and it could all be operated from a control room. Well, John is working, but he's still supervising this little girl. She has the run of the yard. This is her playground. Well, one morning, she's about 4 years old. She's out there playing, and she finds one of these pits to play in, and it's like a little cave for her, and it's her playground, and she's having a good time, and as children do, they get lost in their thoughts. The radio comes on, and there's an unscheduled private train coming. Missy's in the pit where the gear has to be switched. John's hollering and screaming at her, and of course she's lost in play, and she's ignoring him. Here's a private coach with Pullman sleepers behind it, about 200 guests on it. And as it's approaching, John knows he can't get to the little girl in time. Now here's one heck of a decision, people. We're all parents or children, grandparents. What do? Are you going to throw the switch, crush your daughter to death? Or are you going to let a train carrying 200 people fly into oblivion? Let's put that scene on hold for a minute. This is the same decision that God made when he decided to send Jesus to come down here and die for this, well, this fickle human being that he called man. I mean, it tells us in Genesis 6:6 that God regretted that he made human beings on the earth. When he's deciding, what are we going to do about these human beings? Should I condemn my innocent, flawless son to save these troublesome humans that are pretty close to impossible to please? Or should he just abandon man to his contemptuous ways? Well, we don't have to wonder in this instance, because John 3:16 tells us exactly what he decided to do. God loved this being that he had made so much that he gave his only begotten son. Now, I've never, ever understood why an omnipotent force, an all-powerful being, would sacrifice his only beloved son for this troublesome entity called man. Well, I believe the Bible gives us the answer to that too. 1 Corinthians 13:13. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And that's what God loved man so much. You know, God could have chose the rocks to cry out and worship him. But he gave man the free will to decide if we would worship him. And how God could love such a weak, sin-prone being that he'd give his only son, I don't know. I'm humbled by the thought of it. Love has to be the key to answering this question. The scripture says that love is the greatest gift that God has blessed us with. The ability to love is what prevents man from being a savage. Throughout history, we've seen a few people that didn't have that love. A couple of Adolf Hitler, Idi Amin. They wanted to get rid the world of people they decided were less than desirable. But what if God had decided to save only the good people? That's kind of scary, because in Romans 3:10 it says there are none righteous, no, not one. So I guess it was all or nothing. And we know what he did. The group that I rode with I told you, it was called the Good News Riders. Well, the guy that formed this, Jimmy Genoble, chose that name for a particular reason. It was kind of like a conversation starter. Get people to ask you, well, what is the good news? And by the way, Curtis Silcock's ministry is also named the Good News Ministry. But when people would approach us and say, what is the good news? I said, well, the good news is that nobody has to go to hell. You can choose to if you want to. You have that privilege. But God sent his only begotten son that you didn't have to. Well, I think we had a men's prayer breakfast in December. Brother Charles gave us a real good message, and he talked about love too. After he had spoken, we talked, and I told him I was planning for this meeting, and I felt led to speak on love too. I just don't believe it's a coincidence that God keeps throwing this message of love at us. We've all heard Brother Jacob say more than once, what we got to do is bring them in here and love on them. Well, Baton Rouge needs love. We're not that big of a city, and we're like in the top 4 or 5 in murder in the United States. Those of you that went through the flood of 2016, if you remember, for about 2 months after that flood, anywhere you went in Baton Rouge, people were hugging, they were laughing, they were talking, they were helping each other. They were going into strange communities and helping people clean their houses and rebuild them. The morning of the flood, my mother and I and my son and his wife and child, we had to leave our homes. I eventually wound up with almost 6 feet of water in my house. Brother Les took a picture off the internet. The Sunday morning paper after that flood was my mother and I walking across a parking lot, water about this deep. We had to be evacuated by boat. That morning of the evacuation, I had an epiphany, a life-changing event. After we had gotten my mother into the boat to get out of there, this Marine policeman that had helped us, and I went back up to assist some others. There was this little black lady in a wheelchair on oxygen. I still get choked up on this. We helped her across the parking lot and got her into the boat. And when we put her in the boat, she looked up at me and she said, "Son, do I need to leave this wheelchair for your mother?" This poor little lady has just lost everything she's got in the world. Her house is flooded just like the rest of us. The only thing she could call her own was that wheelchair she was sitting in, and she was willing to give it up to a total stranger. And I thought, my God, if we all had the love this poor little lady had. After, in the following January, the church that we had been evacuated to the Abounding Love Ministries on Hooper Road, they had rebuilt their church, and they called all of us that had been stationed there waiting. They had a service to rededicate their new church. I was really looking forward to seeing this little angel again. And when we got there, I learned she had died in the meantime. So I never got to thank her and tell her how much she meant to me. But I know this has been a short message, but I want to stress about love. And those of us that have been blessed and have so much, we need to share this love. You know, love is one of those commodities that you can share it, give it away, spread it out, and it doesn't diminish, it grows. You can give it away and it'll double on you. And I would love to know that people started referring to Maranatha Church as the Love Church. You can go in there and those people are going to love you. They're going to take care of you. They're going to appreciate you. I know that some of the people in my life that had loved me, in spite of the way I grew up, one of them was Brother Jimmy Walker's mother, Sister Blanche Walker. Those of you that have been around, well, I remember when I had real long hair, earrings, and all those other things. And Sister Blanche was, well, let me back up. My mother and Sister Blanche Walker were close as any two sisters have ever been in this world. When Sister Blanche died, for about 2 days, I thought we might have to hospitalize my mother because she was grieving so hard. But when I'd come to church with that long hair and a ponytail and all that, if anybody said anything, Sister Blanche was my protector. And those of you that remember her, you didn't want to be on the wrong end of her wrath. She was a precious lady that I loved like a second mother, and she always defended me. And to have that kind of love, it stayed with me till this day. Before we close in prayer, I want to remind a few things. Pastor gave us a homework assignment before he left. Who's looked up Jubilee in their Bible? We still got time before he comes back. And I'm a newbie and a newcomer to prayer meeting. I've been coming for about 2.5 months, and it's come to be something I look forward to. And I feel like my week is not started right if I don't do it. So I'm going to make an offer to everybody here. Come to prayer meeting. And at the end of prayer meeting, when we dismiss, if you'll come to me and tell me that you didn't enjoy it, that you don't feel better, I'll give you double your money back. And I also want to say something about Brother John Spurgeon. Brother John prays for everybody in this church, real regular. John is going to the doctor this week and next week to have some checkups in preparation for some eye surgery he has coming up. And I think it's only fitting that all of us lift up John on a regular basis in our prayers as he's lifted up all of us for all of these years.